Welcome to the Technology Risk and Gambling podcast, produced by the Technology Addiction team at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. I'm Professor Sally Gainsbury. This season is titled Informed Decisions, Financial Behaviour in Persuasive Digital Environments. Across these conversations, we're asking one central question: what does it actually take for people to form intentions about money and follow through on them when the digital environments they're navigating are specifically designed to influence their behaviour? This season is supported by BetWell, a tool developed by our team at the University of Sydney, which enables people to bet with more insight, intention, and clarity. BetWell is an example of exactly the kind of intervention we'll be examining this season, one designed to close the gap between what people intend to do and what they actually do. You can find out more at betwell.org.au. This episode, I'm speaking with Tracey West. Dr. Tracey West is a financial capability research and practitioner whose work sits at the intersection of financial education, behavioural change, and consumer wellbeing. Tracey and I will be discussing financial education. In particular, we talk about what are the key mechanisms to influence financial decision and digital literacy, the ways to reach current generations of young adults, and the importance of both system change and consumer protection with education. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to the Technology Risk and Gambling webinar, or Ours It Now podcast series. I'm very excited for my guest today, Tracey West. If you did miss out on last week when I spoke to Anna Maria Lusardi, professor at Stanford University, go and check it out now. But Tracey, in my opinion, is Australia's answer to Professor Anna Maria Lusardi, the really prominent expert on a topic that we're going to get into today. So Tracey is a financial capability researcher and a practitioner, and her work really sits at the intersection of household education, behavioural change, and consumer wellbeing, which is such an important perspective and what makes her really unique. She holds a PhD in finance and has spent her career working in very different settings: research, education, and applied program design. Tracey has taught behavioural finance at Griffith University. She's led and evaluated large-scale financial capabilities initiatives, particularly for young people in Australia. And I'm going to get into Talk Money with the Ecstra Foundation, a program that you led. We might kick off with that because this is Australia's largest face-to-face financial education program. In 2025 alone, Talk Money reached nearly 140,000 students across 635 schools with over 3,000 workshops delivered. And that includes reaching a third of these in lower socioeconomic communities and a quarter in regional and rural areas. And for our listeners who are outside of Australia, Australia is really big. And although the concentration of people are on the coast, reaching regional and rural areas is a significant travel issue. And a lot of these areas are often left out. So this program is so important. Over 500,000 students have participated across the life of it. But there is importantly research data evaluating it, which shows a 40% relative increase in students' confidence to manage money and 35% relative increase in their intent to achieve finance goals. So I could go on, and the stats are great. And it's so important that there are evaluated published reports that share all of this and make it really transparent. So Tracey, what I want to start by getting into is really what these numbers mean, what they don't mean, and that how we approach finance, financial literacy, confidence, and the skills, and the gap between what people know, what they intend, and what they actually follow through with, because this is, I think, the crux at what you've been working on for your career. So, I'm really excited to have you on today and hope that we can have a go at talking through these huge issues.
Fabulous. Well, thank you for that intro, Sally, and it is lovely to meet you, and thank you for all the work that you do in your really important field of research. So thank you for having me on today. The Talk Money with Ecstra Foundation program, when I had the opportunity to join that program, I jumped at it because I really wanted to get my hands dirty and see what's happening on the ground, so to speak, in schools and talk with teachers and engage in that space, because we know when students come through to university or they leave school and they go to other settings, they're less of a captive audience in those settings. So schools are a really, really important place to see what's happening around building that financial literacy, financial capability skills, and also talking to teachers around their engagement in that space. So really happy to join that program. And so just to put it into some context, most of our workshops are delivered around the highly populated metro, outer metro areas, and then we do travel to regional areas via roadshows. Really excitingly, we've been to like the west coast of Tasmania, North Queensland, all parts of Western Australia. So those experiences are really good, and we do really make sure that we get out into the regional areas and we don't want to leave them behind. But for some more context, we have different workshops tailored to different age groups before I go into the evaluation results. And they're age appropriate. So year 5 and 6 is around needs and wants, influences on spending, how to have conversations about money with family, friends. For year 7 and 8, it gets more into spending and saving, setting budgets and goal setting, and how to manage those external pressures again. And we do talk about in-app gaming in those workshops, and the currencies and, what the screen is trying to influence you to do. And then in year 9 and 10, it's all about money and working, understanding your rights at work and how to have difficult conversations if need be with a trusted adult or your work manager if you are not getting paid the right amount or if there's some question amounts there. So we do embed in our workshops the talking about money aspect and developing confidence to talk about money. We are only there for 45 minutes to 60 minutes for a lesson, so there's really limited, and we do provide a workshop A and workshop B with some teacher resources in between, but there is a limit as to what we can do. So we don't focus so much on financial knowledge, although we do talk about concepts. We talk about skills to talk about money, and that's what we emphasize. So in our evaluation results, it is all about measuring their self-perceived change in their confidence to engage with money issues, achieve financial goals, and ability to talk about money, their confidence to talk about money. So there's a high correlation between what we do in the workshops and what we can reasonably achieve and what we evaluate. So that's where we see really good self-perceived improvement in confidence, willingness, ability to engage with this. And, what was really comforting for me is seeing those results be consistent across the years. Since Talk Money started. So it wasn't just those early adopters who are really keen to take on these workshops and do it. As our program grew, those results were really consistent across the years. So really pleased to see that stability there.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I really love that focus you have, not just on education, because as you say, and I'm going to get into the delivery and how you reach people. So the fact that you've got into schools is incredible because, as you say, it's a great captive audience and we do run out of those pretty quickly. So getting people in schools and opening up that conversation, taking away any stigma, and perhaps we can talk a little bit about, what you're focusing on now is not just the information and the knowledge, but how to have the conversation, being confident and feeling allowed to raise it, because money is still one of the taboo. And I feel it's so silly, with everything that's discussed. And I was watching a comedian last night, like there's no taboo topics now, basically. But I feel like money and maybe gambling are still in that basket of what people feel uncomfortable speaking about. And people who don't feel comfortable speaking about it are the least likely to learn about it. And we do know that from research that people whose family don't talk about money, suffer in terms of later financial literacy. So can you talk me through that idea when you have a limited time period? How do you choose what skills or confidence and how people should at various ages start to be looking for the right answers?
Oh, really great question. We do provide some, where to go for more information and help resources in our workshop as well. But talking to your financial socialization point, what we are trying to do is find the psychological safety to talk about this and establish that. And, younger generations are more open to talking about things than us, and older generations than us. And we learnt from our parents bad habits, like not to talk about money, and it was taboo, and you don't ask these things and you don't do that. So we are breaking down those barriers, and that's what we can focus on, is providing that safe space. And what's really interesting in terms of our results, and other financial education studies do this too, is the teacher's perspective. So they see the students asking questions from our facilitators, putting their hands up, really keen to learn, and what they're asking in their questions. And so the teachers realize that it is important to do more of this in class, and it provides the teachers with confidence to do more of it in class, and to provide them with some of that language as to how to go about it. So we do appreciate diverse approaches to managing money, and everyone has a different money story. And that you don't have to be perfect and get the answer to the formula right, per se, like we do tend to focus on in maths when we're doing financial math. So it is just about providing a little bit more of an extension for teachers when they're observing us as to what you can cover and how you can talk about it, without, with trying to overcome the teachers' concerns about talking about money in classroom, whether that's their own socialization and hesitancy to talk about money because that's how they're learned behavior, or also worrying about the students' financial circumstances in the classroom, because they do know when students aren't getting breakfast or aren't getting, all the things that they need at home. So it can be very sensitive, and you don't want to bring up situations where you're comparing students, and some students have more than others. So it is a very delicate situation, and we appreciate that.
Yeah, and that gets to, I really like that distinction you made between financial literacy in math. And that's really critical, because financial literacy is born from economics, and economics is famously fairly rigid in its idea of a rational actor and making, sound decisions. And there'd been a right and a wrong answer to what is the optimal decision to make, which doesn't take into consideration. I really liked your language around the money story, the money background that people have, and we do all have these on top of our human biases. And that when we talk about financial literacy, the big three questions developed by Lusardi and Mitchell have a right and a wrong answer. And financial literacy is often assessed in terms of knowledge. When we look at OECD reports, it's how much knowledge do people have, and it's actually pretty bad, which is a whole nother conversation. But how do you find, you said younger people are more willing to engage in this and not feel so nervous, possibly because they don't know what they don't know. Similarly, I found in my experience as a director of a treatment clinic that when our financial counsellors go out and give workshops, it's much better attended than people who are giving workshops on gambling harm, because everyone's interested in money and everyone it's an area everyone has something to learn in. But we often find that when financial counsellors speak to a target, like community group, the staff end up really hanging out and then approaching and saying, can you actually come back and do one for the staff? Because it is something older generations or any generations haven't had enough literacy in. So I'm wondering if you could talk to how people's individual differences can be catered for, because we have moved away from one size fits all interventions. How can you conduct an intervention in a classroom or give a teacher confidence when there is such individual, either characteristic, like you say, risk taking or confidence and impulsivity and backgrounds?
Mm-hmm. That's a really big question. I think I hesitate to answer that question by saying that there probably aren't good resources that teachers can use at the moment to help them approach that. So, for example, teachers might have access to some materials on budgeting, saving, setting goals, and that sort of thing, but those materials don't often embed in them other cultural approaches to doing those things. So, for example, they don't include a line item in a budget for a First Nations person to help them save for their cultural obligations. So that's an example where the current resources that we have to help provide an appreciation for diversity in our classroom. There are others like Islamic people and Islamic finance is its own field of its own field of finance, really. And there are Asian approaches to money, and like there's all different cultural approaches that if we embedded them in some good resources, we could really start some great conversations in the classroom and understand that there is no one right way to do things, and that if you don't follow this way to do things, you're getting things wrong. And that there's no one answer, and that a budget is set and forget. Like all of these things are flexible and change, and that's what we need to build into our financial education materials, is that we need to adapt and respond. Plan ahead, risk manage, adapt and respond. So I think that teachers are in a hard spot right now in terms of improving the approaches, but there are great teachers and there are great programs out there doing amazing things. And it's going to get better over time as we have these conversations.
I think I'm so glad you raised the cultural differences and the importance of recognizing that. And I have seen really good budgets that do have line items in them for, giving, whether it be, and people often forget this when they're putting a budget together, that, whether it's a birthday present fund or a Christmas fund or a charitable giving or a family, whatever those giving responsibilities are, and just recognizing and having flexibility for different things, because people do need to have a prompt, to think. Really, it's difficult to put a budget together, and I think a little bit too flippantly sometimes that as policy is, set a budget, decide what you can spend, and not appreciating how actually complex that is for people to do. So I guess that's what I want to ask about is, you do have this strong background in the Ecstra Foundation and also in teaching university students. And I'm going to get a little bit more into the age and generational cohort next. But before we get there, what are the core programs? Whether you've got 45 minutes or a semester, you talked about some of those principles like having an emergency fund or putting the habit of creating an emergency fund, more specifically the behaviour, being able to adapt. And I know you've talked previously about being aware of your own emotional responses and planning in advance. So can you talk me through what you think the core components are? Is it building knowledge? Is it creating, being aware of your own personal biases? Is it putting in place behavioural habits? What do you think the really big differences are if we're going to start nudging people towards having a healthy financial attitude, knowledge and behaviour?
Oh, big question. Look, I think the first thing to do is understand the importance of regular saving. So you got to nail that habit, right? You got to set up a system where some portion of your income is being taken out of your spending bank account and put away into a long-term saving bank account, so that you can't spend it. So I think that's a key thing, probably in the first workshop, that you would do if you're talking about saving, spending, goal setting, budgets and things. People have to leave that workshop with a way to do that for themselves, and understanding that it can be 50 cents. Like, you got to start small, because what I really think is people on low incomes, we need to design workshops for people on low incomes that are struggling and give something achievable for them, to help those that need it most. So it's that regular saving, getting the safety net, precautionary savings, so that you can handle an emergency, because when your car breaks down and you can't get to work, that affects your ability to earn an income. So you've got to be able to navigate through those financial shocks. Then I think that it is goal setting, perhaps, and achievable goals. Knowing what to do with your savings if you have money left over after spending, and meeting your needs. So it is investing and how to get a return on your investment, like compound interest, and understanding that, and how inflation also affects your savings. So it is So you brought up the Anna Maria Lasardi Mitchell 3 questions or 5 questions before. Even though they are somewhat problematic and limited, those questions, they do help categorize people into knowing what to do with your money once you've saved it and you have some left over, and those that don't. So those diversification, compound interest, and inflation questions are quite important. And I grapple with it's not an ideal measurement tool because there are lots of good money management approaches that aren't captured by that tool, but they are key concepts that are important.
I might, yeah, just drill pause you on that. And for people who don't know about the 3 or 5 questions, you can listen to the first episode with Anna Maria. But they're questions that, and I've spoken with Anna Maria about how they were developed. And when you've only got 3 questions, it is difficult to put things together. But the key idea of knowing some terms. And they're not based on sort of huge calculations, but they're based on understanding principles. But they are principles rooted in finance. And again, people might not always have that language or being explicitly taught these things. So can you then tell me what else you think is important? You've talked about these behaviours, so regular savings, setting goals, knowing what to do. They're a combination of sort of knowledge, behaviour, skills. How would you assess? What would you say is what would you be looking for if saying someone's got would you use the term healthy or sustainable? What are you looking for as a good outcome?
Uh, financial well-being indicators, included in that list of indicators is someone who feels in control of their money. So to be able to feel in control of your money, you need to be managing your current expenses and have some stored away for future shocks and long-term wealth accumulation or some kind of financial security in the future. So there are some key indicators you can look at for financial well-being that is more holistic, that includes your socioeconomic, demographic factors, your attitudes, your knowledge, and your ability to plan ahead and plan for the future. Save regularly, set goals, and that sort of thing.
I think that's really, it is a big topic and it's more than just one measure. And I think that's why there's a bit of a struggle with it because A, it's hard to measure. And then how, you've got 45 minutes in a classroom once a year or maybe, once every couple of years if they get the program at different levels. You've got university students for a semester, is it?
Well, so some universities, and not many, do have a personal finance course that could be an elective that any student could take at the university, like University of Western Australia has that. But otherwise, you might be enrolling in an economics major or a finance major or a business course, and you'll get some of this, but not a dedicated personal finance course. So that's the market in Australia. There are some universities that do an outreach program, so they might go into schools with their finance students to deliver some workshops, like they do at the University of Melbourne in the street finance program. But really, there is not a whole lot at universities unless there are programs delivered by the services part of a university.
Like the wellbeing,
student support services.
Yeah.
And
they sometimes
that can
do,
come
but
and go. Yeah.
yeah, international students or things like this sometimes. But yeah, it is. And in terms of delivering these workshops, what is the right mechanism? It's a big ask, and I feel like I'm just throwing these massive questions at you, so I'll try and break it down. But you're so knowledgeable, I want to take advantage of that. You've got to engage people, you've got to try and impart knowledge. I've heard you talk about storytelling. What do you think are the kind of key ways that you can either, is it a hook that then you get people interested and they go keep learning on their own? Is it really making an impression on them? What are the key education resources that you can start if you've got an opportunity for someone for the first time?
Oh, great question. I think the stories are fantastic. When a colleague a research colleague, Laura Deswan, and I went into schools and asked them about what they knew about some financial concepts. So we just asked some year 10 students what they could tell us they knew about inflation. Ones that could recall it had a story. They had watched a documentary. They could tell us about something that happened in the Roman times, and it's a historic documentary that they watched, and they could recall the concept. So stories are really important in helping people to learn. I think a good educator might be able to find those stories, but I actually myself find it quite challenging to source all of those different stories, even though I am constantly looking for them. So it is quite a it's quite a challenge to be a good financial educator. I think you really do have to know your audience and what they're interested in and where they need some help. So ideally, you do some pre-workshop surveys to find out what they're interested in and tailor it to that. At university, for example, we could have all different age levels in a workshop. It could be school leavers, your 18 to 22-year-olds, but it could also be mature students or students working part-time and studying part-time. So there's a real mix of experiences there and needs and current needs. And then there are a whole heap of interactions with the financial ecosystem that I think you need to be aware of so that you can handle some questions. Like there are a whole heap of tax changes announced in the budget this week, and there are so many questions popping up around what that means for people. So you have to have a really good knowledge base. So I think being a financial educator is not an easy job, and there's lots to be aware of. I went and delivered a workshop for Women's Day a couple of years ago at a corporation, and I got like really bogged down in, how do I talk to my children about pocket money versus how do I convert my shares that I receive as part, a bonus payment into something. So it was just so diverse, the conversation. There really is a lot of concepts and fields you can traverse in a conversation, and it's not easy. So I do think it is tricky to know how to structure your workshop so that it is engaging and relevant and people can take away things, but not impossible. But I do want to go back to, there has been some really good research by Richard Nettemeyer in the United States. He's done some really good work over the years, and one that he released in 2024 with colleagues that evaluated the effectiveness of financial education programs and looked at the concentration of financial knowledge in the program, and then also your well-being, so your confidence to do things, your subjective knowledge, evaluation questions from those financial education workshops. And he did find that the knowledge part of the workshop was really important, but what's more important is for people to come away feeling more confident, and that affects downstream behaviors. That actually affects the intention to do things and the actual ability and the doing of things. So setting up your savings account or getting your affairs in order and more organized with tracking your expenses, setting savings goals and working towards achieving them, all of those sorts of things. So a financial education workshop, the components it has to have is building familiarity with the finance vocabulary, the concepts, how they apply in the ecosystem, but also building people's confidence and giving them activities to help build their confidence in the workshop and then after they leave the workshop. And the duration is also important. So it's a hard ask to do something in a 45-minute, 60-minute one-off workshop. But if you have a longer workshop where you're returning to the class, you're asking questions about last week's content, getting answers, reinforcing your knowledge, reviewing it as you go, like a semester-long program would, you're getting longer duration, you're learning more, you're fitting more into that workshop program, and you're embedding those topics. You're discussing with your peers too. Like you and I know that often it's not about, in a university course or even in school, it's often not about what the teacher says and does and shows you what to do. It's about how you reinforce that with your classroom peers. and you test ideas and things with them. So it's your peers that are also really important in those workshops. So there are some elements to think about, and for public policymakers who are thinking about financial education workshops and what value they bring, they can be really effective if they have those components of building confidence.
That's so much information there, and we'll put a link to the in the show notes to that study you mentioned by Nepomai. I want to come back to something I said I would. I sort of dropped a breadcrumb there because you have looked at some really important groups, and I think we haven't explicitly said it, but universal programs are typically ineffective. You've said there that everyone has so much information, and I think the fact that you've given a breakfast talk in International Women's Day, and you're mobbed with questions goes to show how hungry people are for this information, and that likely reflects the few resources that people have and the opportunities they have, and this is reflected in the research. The AMP surveys, for example, show that well less than half of people have access or feel confident to go and seek financial advice, or they're not sure. You have to pay for it. There are so many barriers. They don't have the confidence to do so. So when they have someone in front of them, they're hungry for this information, for personalized information, which is notoriously difficult to get. So I think that we do need to tailor resources and strategies for different populations. And psychology is pretty good at looking at individual differences, and specifically in terms of age. And, I'm from a gambling background, and the gambling field has long talked about young adults as a really key risk cohort. But young adults is an age. What I'm interested in is your background and your knowledge of the finance ecosystem in Australia. Talk more about generational differences, which is really important, because a young adult who was a young adult in 2000 and 2005 when I was studying is different from a young adult in 2026, and we can't just lump them all in and say all young adults. So can you talk me through what is the current young adult generation dealing with? We've talked about these things of a mental health crisis and digital natives, but what are the specific issues that we need to think about when communicating with young adults today about making decisions, whether it's gambling, spending money, Uber Eats? There's a whole different world out there.
Yeah, and I think that's where we need to look at systems change. But, in terms of what you said out there, a teenager in one afternoon could be watching an influencer talk about investing, can buy something online using a buy now, pay later service, can see a gambling ad in sport, can receive a scam message that looks legitimate. And that's, in the space of a few hours when they're scrolling on their phones. And, we all do face this. But these risks aren't isolated anymore. They're all converging and easily accessible and exposed to on our phones. So my perspective is that financial education can help. In regard to that kind of afternoon experience, it can help build a finance vocabulary, can explain different levels of risk and why there are different levels of risk. It can help people understand the different types of loans and what they cost, and explain why some are more expensive than others. Emphasize the importance of planning ahead and saving up and resisting temptation and delayed gratification. It can talk about gambling and who wins and deceptive and addictive design, and can raise awareness of scams, but also legitimate and trusted sources of information. So financial education can do a bit, but it can't do everything. We do need systems change and protections there to help lessen our exposure to these things, because the onus isn't all on the individual, and the governments do have the power to intervene in those systems, and they do. And to be honest, this government is doing some things to help us with those big problems.
Yeah, and let's discuss that a little bit further, because financial literacy and financial education does talk about a systems level of people, of sort of resources out there provided for people to try and enhance capabilities. But it does then put the onus back on the individual to engage with those resources, to act on that knowledge, to then go forth into the world, which is increasingly working against them. We're operating in an environment where we've currently in Australia got major grocery chains in court for fair trading practices and deceptive marketing on the shelf. I mean, if people can't, let alone going online, if people can't even walk into a shop and expect to see transparent information, we're certainly consumers are operating in an environment that's potentially geared against them. What is the role you see of individuals versus commercial entities and governments in this issue?
Well, so we need both. And if we had to choose between financial education or systems change, then you need to prioritize probably systems change if you can only choose between those two. But the OECD and its International Network on Financial Education do publish a lot of leadership public policy papers. And they have recently published one that said the roles are complementary. So you do need financial education and you do need systems change. You need consumer protections and you need those to be really strong. So they encourage governments and support governments in ways that systems change can happen. So like this government, for example, have been dealing with scams for a long time. They set up the Scam Centre and they are making banks, telecommunication providers and digital platforms more responsible for taking down scam posts and refunding customers or dealing with those issues from their customers. So there is work being done, even though it might be invisible to you and I every day. There is a lot of posts being taken down and a lot of intervention there. And scam statistics are declining over time, which is good news, but still, like the money lost to scams, and they're so creative and inventive. But pleasingly, like you hear around you that people receive a post or a message about something and like, oh, is that a scam? They are questioning it. So it does take time to help develop those preventative tools. ASIC is also doing a lot of prosecutions. There is more money for financial counsellors than there has been before, even though it's never enough. There is a little bit more. Government are funding like a match savings program or providing funding support for a match savings program, which is really good. And yeah, the supermarket inquiry into price gouging. And I think just doing those things and it being in the news, it makes people aware that, oh, they put prices up and then they discount them. So it makes people more aware of the practices when the government is taking action on these things and it's in the news. So there is systems change happening. It is always slow and it is never enough, but there is a little bit there. And I know they're looking into deceptive design as well, but
yes,
we'll see what they can do there.
And I agree. I think, I was in America recently, and certainly I think Australia is doing pretty well in terms of some of the practices. And it is really difficult. I'm certainly not trying to say policymakers have an easy task, because certainly, my background is in gambling, and there's a real tension between individual wanting responsibility and consumer freedom, not wanting a nanny state, and then expecting, and a commercial legal industry. But where is the line between commercial practices and marketing and coercion or deception? And I think that we as a society haven't necessarily settled on that. And there's a lot of grey areas. And so having these conversations openly, I guess I really like your point on just giving people the language and talking about it and reducing stigma around talking out loud, and sharing experiences can be so powerful.
Yeah. I think to your point earlier with younger generations being digital natives, over time there will be more tools available to them to help them manage some of these problems. So banks know with their big data and our own transaction data what we're up to. For years and years, they have beta tested, nudging people with little notifications to help them try and manage their money. So, for example, you spent $200 more on groceries this week than you did last week, or some kind of little nudge notification. Like they can do that, and they have tried doing that, but there's a lot of resistance but the people receiving those about the big brother oversight and why you manage my money, and now I don't trust you. So there's a lot writing on it from banks if they do intervene in that space. But with the Consumer Data Protection Right, that's a legislative framework that allows other companies to get your bank data if you give them permission. And then they can develop an app that you've chosen to subscribe to that is something that you want to help to manage your money. So you can set up some kind of spending limits for yourself where you get a notification if you spent more going out on the weekend, or, you know, you're up to your spending limit for this and that, you'll get a notification. So there are things coming that younger generations will naturally want to help them to manage their money. It's going to be completely different from us who are left to our own devices to manage it.
Yes, with an Excel spreadsheet or a piece of paper somewhere, or jam jars, going back to cash in one pile versus another.
And I think it's worth starting in those points for younger people in school. It's worth modeling it physically.
Oh yeah,
with real money before we transition to a digital environment.
You've given me a great for the listeners of us. These are as a present from Stanford Institute of Finance. So you've got save, share, spend, and invest. Literal jars to put your money in. So definitely having these these physical cues are super important. And I think you've purposely set up too, which wasn't intended, for the BetWell tool that we're launching very soon, which is allowing consumers to be in charge of their own data, because we do have this asymmetry between operators that have all the data, whether it be a gambling company or an e-commerce platform, and that consumers don't have that data, and that data isn't working for them. It's potentially working against them, depending on how the company is choosing to do that, which again, the consumer does not have control over. So I agree with you. We really want to see consumers using their data and be able to easily access their own data for their own tracking, their own monitoring, and to understand the projections. We know from a long time ago, if you put some tomato sauce in your shopping basket, you're likely to buy pasta and Parmesan cheese. So we want consumers to do the same thing and look at your own data. They should be able to see their own projections of where they're going and then decide, do I want that, or do I want to change my behavior? So that's all something that we're working for in the BetWell platform. But what I want to do is finish up with some rapid fire questions that you bring such wealth of knowledge. I want people to have some more opportunities to follow up on your line of thinking. So can you tell me what is maybe one book? You've mentioned a few reports and resources, and we'll put as many as we can in the show notes. But what would you recommend someone start reading if they want to go deeper onto this topic, or these topics we've talked about a lot?
Oh, look, I find it really hard to recommend one book. I'm going to say anything by Daniel Kahneman, Richard Thaler, Robert Schiller, and Dan Ariely on how we think about money and then how that interacts with the world that we're in. So those behavioral scientists, make you think and appreciate that there's more to what we're doing in our brain than we're consciously aware of. Also, I'll just say I'm really interested in First Nations approaches to resource management and how they've so successfully managed our environment for 40,000 plus years. So books by Tyson Yunkaporta, really insightful, really make you think. And so I'll just give that a little plug there too. That's for the adventurous, though.
That's perfect, and my bookshelf is filled with those. And fortunately now, behavioral economists like Richard Thaler are writing books in a really accessible way, so you don't have to read something dry. I find them just absolutely fascinating. So I will definitely put some links there. And then, are you listening to anyone? Are there any podcasts or social media profiles for sort of ongoing, whether they're snippets or longer form content?
One I always come back to is Cautionary Tales by Tim Harford. He's an economist based in University in London. I can't remember which one, but just really interesting stories that relate to an economic concept or human behavior, and just fascinating. And he's just lovely voice. So always come back to that one.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Look, Tracey, this has been a really valuable conversation. I've taken so much away. In particular, I really like your emphasis on moving away from necessarily knowledge to increasing someone's confidence around uh, building their own, we'll use the term financial literacy for sort of a placeholder of all of those things that go into that. And I think this is so important and has been a great way to start steering this conversation of the technology, risk and gambling podcast series. So thank you so much for your time, for your honesty about what the evidence shows, what we don't have evidence for, and taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Sally. It's been a pleasure.
That's Dr. Tracey West. It was so interesting to hear her take on the key mechanisms behind education financial literacy, and particularly the role of confidence as opposed to particular knowledge or skills in making a key difference to digital financial behaviours. What I take from this conversation is the importance of financial education and financial literacy, but that it's not a one-off conversation. It has to happen ideally in the household, in schools, in university and work environments, and with friends and colleagues. And that the ability and language and confidence to have this conversation will make a key difference in people's ability to learn, gather resources that will inform their current and future financial decisions. If today's episode raised questions for you, I'd encourage you to check out the resources that we link to in the podcast show notes. I'd like to pay my respects for the elders past, present and emerging on the land on which I'm recording this episode, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. You can find the Technology, Risk and Gambling podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and wherever you listen. The video version of every episode is available on the Brain and Mind Centre's YouTube channel. If this series is useful to you, please share it with colleagues and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Special thanks to the production team behind the Technology, Risk and Gambling podcast series and making it sound fantastic every episode and lining all the details up. Eunice Wynne and Fergus Lyons. I'm Sally Gainsbury. Thank you for listening.